Hi everyone, welcome back to Module 8, Wexford University, AA 105, Lifestyle Fitness Coach. Now, before we get into the content for Module 8, I just want to draw your attention to your final project, which will be due at the end of Module 9 or Week 9 by Friday at 5 p.m. And the instructions for your final project are also included in your syllabus, so if you lose any of what's being stated now, you can always refer back to the syllabus for the written explanation of the project. But essentially, what you'll be doing is writing about or actually including coaching dialogues along the theme of the trans-theoretical model and the stages of change, or how people move through making a change or the change process in terms of human development and learning and change. So we've discussed this previously in the course, but for your final project, you will work with either another real client, which could be a friend or a family member, or this could actually be a virtual or imaginary client, because what you're really doing is documenting the possible dialogues, in that case with an imaginary or virtual client, that you may have with the subject while they're in this pre-contemplative mode of making a decision. So we know that the trans-theoretical model had different stages, and we're really going to zero in on only the pre-contemplative stage. So in terms of presentation or style, as close to APA format is of course preferred. So refer to Chapter 9 for these coaching dialogue examples, but keep in mind that there's no minimum for the paper, but it should definitely be less than 7 pages in length. So be sure to contact me via email if you have any questions or if I can clear anything up for you about your final project. All right, so now we're going to move into Module 8, where we continue along the lines of more of those coaching skills that are important. And we've spent the previous 7 modules really laying foundation work, and in Module 7 we got into a little bit more of those skills that we use to coach clients, because we have this incredible power of influence over our client. And in fact, Module 8 is about influencing clients in the change processes. So what we're going to be doing is looking at skills that are used to influence clients. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as I've mentioned, in Module 8, we're going to really focus more on those skills used to influence clients along the change continuum or the change process. So we need to be able to look at different skills that are used to influence your client. And this can include any of these bullets that you see on the slide before you. It, of course, includes feedback. Sometimes includes confrontation, and this is not to say it's a negative or combative form of confronting the client, but there are some times when we need to speak to a client that confronts issues or concerns that we have, or maybe it's even to address clients in terms of maybe some concerns that you've seen in inconsistencies with behavior versus statements made. We also want to understand a little bit more about self-disclosure through exploring ways to use self-disclosure. Then we'll wrap up with some interpretations that are required for providing feedback in terms of framing or really using reflections with clients to provide a certain type of feedback. And then finally, we will talk about or uncover some of what we call solution skills. As you can see, the first skill or influencing skill that we're going to talk about is feedback. And this could in some ways be looked at as a reflection or a summary of what's being fed back to the client in terms of what they're saying or what they're telling you, or sometimes what you're seeing or what you're hearing sometimes between the lines. So feedback is important because it's one of the main ways that a coach will use a strategy or a technique to really structure dialogue to increase the client's awareness when they're either just beginning to formulate change patterns or when they're actually in the midst of making change efforts. So we have to be able to understand the use of feedback and provide it to clients in our coactive relationships with them. We could also seek to define feedback as a way to look at methods of giving clients specific data about what we or what others are seeing in them. And so feedback becomes a really important part of the communication between the coach and the client. If you ask an experienced coach, they will agree very quickly with the statement that it is pretty common for clients to make mistakes during change efforts. In fact, a well-seasoned or experienced coach will encounter clients making mistakes or falling short of goals on a pretty consistent basis. And this is just a part of the normal coactive coach-client relationship when paired with human behavior, because no one's perfect, and that should be understood and pretty clear. So this could really just be a situation where maybe your client veers off course from maybe some goals that have been set in the interim or sub-goals in between sessions as part of the major goals that have been formulated as part of your change plans or your efforts to make positive changes with your client's physical health in this case. So what do coaches do when their clients fail to hit goals or when they veer off course? Well, the answer is pretty clear, because we're talking about influencing skills and more specifically feedback, which is exactly what coaches use to give clients updates on their progress or to give them some sort of reflective summary of what the coach is seeing or what others might be seeing in terms of the client being able to make successful steps and changes toward their change effort. So in this way, feedback is viewed as error correction. Sometimes feedback can also be a way of deepening your client's understanding, or even a way to either promote or encourage learning. So there's a significant part of working with the client that includes educating the client on various items or aspects of their change or their physical health in this case. Clients also need to learn new skills during their change efforts, and remember, if these were things that they could do on their own, they may not have sought out a coach to begin with. So clients will need to learn along the way in order to reach their goals. And this requires that this learning be ongoing throughout their change efforts. This therefore requires feedback. And this learning adventure for the client can sometimes be more valuable than actually hitting an outcome goal. Now we look at the when and the what part of feedback in terms of timing and the actual content of your feedback to your client. Now, using feedback is typically most effective when the client simply asks for it, or when there is what we call implied consent. In other words, along the way, your client gives you permission to provide feedback, and this would only be a problem if you've been providing feedback that's unsolicited or gratuitous and not really welcome from the client. So making sure that the client is ready to receive feedback is a timing concern from the coach and a skill that you have to learn. Feedback should also always reference your client's strengths and their assets, especially if you're about to provide feedback that's related to a problem that the client is showing you or some sort of dysfunctional patterns that you're seeing in the client's behavior. Another aspect of any feedback that you provide clients is that it should relate back to those things that the client can control and change. And this also means that feedback that you provide to your client has to relate to the client's goals. So the client has to be able to understand the situation to be one that's under their control whenever you're giving feedback. In other words, it would be pointless or a waste of both your and your client's time to provide feedback on things or situations or circumstances or even behaviors that are outside of the client's control. When you provide feedback to a client, even when it's positive or something less than ideal or difficult to provide back to the client, it's really important to be both concrete and specific. So whenever possible, you want to try to include any details of anything that's verifiable, such as times or places or even events or happenings and even the words that are coming from your client. So make an effort to also keep any judgment out of feedback that's provided, because as coaches, we don't do judgment with our client because it's just not congruent with a coactive dynamic between the coach and client. And sometimes this might require that the coach checks their emotions at the door, because this could easily come off as judgment if we're not careful. Now, we've spent some time trying to teach coaches how to provide feedback and when the timing is appropriate and what it should be. But this is coming from the coach, and we also want to understand how the client takes our feedback. So we want to make sure the client understands what we're stating to them in terms of any feedback that we're providing. So be sure to give your client a chance to confirm this. So have your client confirm their understanding of what's being shared. So try using paraphrasing before getting into discussions about your feedback with clients over what's been stated, because this can eliminate misunderstandings. In terms of the steps required to provide feedback, if you keep the following steps in mind, you'll probably be safe in providing good constructive feedback to your client. The first step is to decide on the time and place of when and where feedback will occur, and if it's necessary, to strategize the best time to provide feedback to your client. You can also try to frame feedback in an organized way so that you're able to zero in on the most critical concerns or issues, or you'll be able to zero in on multiple issues and separate them out to provide feedback at different points along the way. Try to be sure to acknowledge your client's accomplishments and their strengths as well as their assets. Also, it's important to be specific and to express feedback in a manner that's easily validated, and try to do this in a way that avoids referencing third parties. Keep this between yourself and the client. Not all feedback will always be positive. In fact, sometimes it's confrontational. So make sure that your client knows that it's a good idea to clarify any of the feedback that you provide to them. And this is just another check of your communication being successful with your client. So ask your client for responses or their thoughts about feedback that you're providing. And once both parties have shared their thoughts, a new understanding emerges and begins, and we call this a mutual agreement or understanding. We mentioned confrontation in the first or opening slides, and again, this is not to say that we're going to do verbal sparring with our client, but in general, the purpose of confronting clients is to bring conscious awareness to sometimes the discrepancies seen in their actions or their words. So the purpose is to direct clients to examine their thinking or their emotions or their behaviors, or sometimes all of that. This requires that the client be ready to address or acknowledge incongruent actions, and also this requires some delicate communication skills and extreme sensitivity at times. And it's probably one of the most difficult skills for coaches to master and execute. One way to look at confrontation as a useful tool in influencing clients is to use it as a means of exploring. So client functions or even their thought processes may at times have missing pieces, and a coach's confrontations can help a client to be more aware. Being able to identify discrepancies is a way that a coach could use confrontation as an example. So maybe words that come from the client are maybe different from their actions, or maybe even statements that the client's made previously. So sometimes different statements made from the client might be a reflection of change being made, but sometimes they're a result of inconsistencies coming from the client, and this can result in confrontation. Interestingly enough, when we see this sort of inconsistency in clients, it's believed to have roots that are coming from a lack of feedback coming from the coach. The use of self-disclosure is something that coaches should use very carefully in the coaching relationship with their clients, because while it's true that we need to be able to get to know our client very well, sometimes clients want to get to know their coach as well too, and that's all right to a point, but sometimes clients will want to know too much about their coach. So whether or not we share anything about ourselves with our clients depends. So is it useful, or what's the goal of sharing something about yourself? Will it help your client ultimately to get to their goal if they know something about you? There are times when it might, but it also could shape the client's view of the coach in a different manner, and sometimes that can be good or bad. So in general, will it help your client and you build rapport and trust? If so, then it might be okay, but it's not always okay to just, as a blanket rule, apply the practice of using self-disclosure with clients. In general, if you decide to self-disclose, it's safe to do so if you understand that you're perceiving and reacting to a present situation based on something in your past, but it has to always be relevant to your client right now. If you decide to share something with your client, and if you feel it's useful and something that's going to help them get to their goal, make sure that what you share is focusing more on present realities and not as much as the history behind it. It's really important that you include the feelings that are related to what you're disclosing as much as the facts. And self-disclosure should have depth in terms of personal revelations, and in this way we're trying to say it should be profound or deep and meaningful. And self-disclosure should also be reciprocal, especially in newer coaching relationships. Self-disclosure is also useful when it's a modeling tool or when we're trying to model behavior for our client. And in this way, we can really impact the increase or improvement of trust and the alliance of our relationship with the client. And this can be something that helps to persuade clients to see a new perspective, or it can improve the client's self-acceptance. In other words, they come to see that they're not going through something alone because you're sharing that you've done it too. Be sure to read more on interpretations in your textbook, but in general, interpretations are nothing more than a hunch or your intuition, and this comes as a result of experience. The intuition is a key element in being a successful coach. So try adding implied messages that include reflections, or consider paraphrasing what you're interpreting or what you're hearing from your client. And this will help to more precisely communicate to your client what you're hearing or how you're seeing things coming from the client. Try to use reframing to demonstrate a more positive way of paraphrasing what your client's saying. Solution skills that we provide to clients really include these three main bullet points: instructions, information, and suggestions. Now, instructions are just that, what we tell our clients to do, or when we talk about what they think or what they're feeling. In terms of information, this is what we share with clients to increase their awareness and their understanding of matters at hand, and sometimes it's used to persuade clients. Lastly, we look at suggestions, which are sometimes not wanted, but instead clients might be wanting to help understand how to manage their circumstances. So they're not looking for your suggestions, they're maybe knowing what to do, they just don't know how to make those interim steps. So in this case, it's still suggestions that are most useful and helpful, and they're still being required of us, but how we use them becomes very important. And we don't want to provide suggestions to someone who's not open to it, just like they would with feedback. So that concludes Module 8, and Module 9 is a little bit different, so we will regroup with that next week when we talk about coaching dialogues.